April 1241, Eastern Hungary on the Sajo River. A European army is making tense camp. There are noble knights here, footmen, crossbowmen. Even King Bela IV of Hungary himself is in this camp. Everyone knows the danger is right outside. Word had just reached the front. The Tatars, the Mongols, had smashed through the Russ's lands, swept Poland, and were rolling toward Europe's heart like a black storm. And now, that storm had finally reached them. Days earlier, horsemen the Europeans called messengers of hell had appeared outside their lines. The knights in camp trusted their heavy armor, their long swords, and crossbows kept ready to fire. They believed that holding the Sajo Bridge, backed by a tight camp and armored knights, would keep these steppe riders on the far bank. At least, that's what they believed that night. But just before dawn, things went wrong. The Mongols weren't just cavalry charging blindly forward, as the Europeans imagined. First, they pinned the bridgehead with catapults and arrows, then crossed downstream and swung around the flank. The Hungarians thought the bridge was the target, but Subutai really wanted to seal off the camp's escape routes. As Mongol riders closed in from every direction, the Europeans suddenly realized they weren't facing wild horsemen at all, but the most refined war machine of the 13th century. This was the Battle of Mohi. Many assume the Mongol Empire never conquered Europe because European knights finally held the line. But here's the twist. Mohi wasn't a European victory. It was a European catastrophe. Put yourself in the Mongol commander's place. You've just won Europe's most decisive battle. The king has fled. What's the obvious next move? By normal logic, you push on. But strangely, soon after this victory, the Mongols didn't push on toward Vienna, the German lands, or Italy. They suddenly stopped advancing west. So here's our question. The Mongols had clearly won. Why not press on and take all of Europe? Too much land to govern? Or was something else going on? So who really won? Let's start with why the Mongols were in Europe. The Mongol invasion of Europe was no accident. As early as Genghis Khan's day, Mongol campaigns and scouts had already mapped the Cuman steppe, the Russ's principalities, and Eastern Europe. Under Ögedei Khan, the Western campaign formally began. Batu, Guyuk, Mungke, all the Genghisid princes drawn in, with veterans like Subutai personally commanding the field. What does that mean? It tells us the push west was an empire-level strategy, not one general's personal gamble. But on the other hand, we shouldn't picture it as some modern-style plan to conquer Europe. The Mongols likely had no fixed goal of Paris, Rome, or all Western Europe. It was more like an ever-extending chain of war. First the Cuman steppe, then the Russ's principalities, then Poland and Hungary. Break one link, expose the next. Any power that refused to submit, sheltered their enemies, or blocked their path simply became the next target. Mongol ambitions kept growing. So, Mohi wasn't some battle that happened by chance. It was the inevitable result of the Mongol advance reaching Europe's heart. Europe then wasn't one strong, unified empire. It was a patchwork of feudal lands. And don't go picturing medieval Europe as today's European nations. There was no European high command, no button anyone could push to send every army into action. Kings had their own agendas, dukes their own interests, knights fought for their lords, cities looked after their trade and walls. On paper, everyone belonged to Christendom, but try forming an alliance, and you'd find plenty of courage and almost none of the unity the Mongol army had. Europe's old order ran on oaths, fiefs, family, and church, fine in peacetime, but against an enemy as fast and as unified as the Mongols, the cracks showed fast. What made the Mongol army so terrifying was never just great horse archery. Many steppe peoples could ride and shoot. Why did the Mongols reach the Danube? The key is that they weren't the simple-minded barbarians people imagine. They were tactical masters who fused steppe mobility, intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, engineering, and iron discipline, and could toy with a powerful enemy at will. They'd feign retreat to pull enemies out of formation, split into columns so no one knew where the main force was, lay siege with advanced catapults, and use scouted terrain to pick the best ground for encirclement. In other words, the Europeans thought they faced brave Mongol riders. What they actually faced was a player controlling the whole board, one whose defeats often left them not even understanding how they'd lost. In April 1241, that player landed 2 heavy blows in quick succession. First, at Legnica in Poland, a Mongol detachment crushed the allied Polish and Silesian force, led by Duke Henry II of Silesia. Almost simultaneously, the main Mongol army was closing in on Bela IV in Hungary. Legnica was a blow to the flank, knocking out Northern Europe's ability to organize relief. But it was Mohi that would truly seal Hungary's fate. The Mongols weren't striking at random. They hit several key points on one map at once. You might be asking, why were the Mongols so fixed on Hungary? One big reason: the Cumans. They'd once held land from the Black Sea to the southern steppe. This wasn't some backwater. It was the corridor where the Eurasian steppe kept stretching west. After crushing Khwarezm, the Mongols pushed west and were bound to meet the Cuman powers here. The Cumans didn't simply submit at first. Their ties with the Rus were complicated. As the Mongols advanced, some Cuman chiefs allied with Rus's princes against them. The clearest case is 1223's Battle of the Kalka River, where Cumans and Rus's princes fought the Mongols, and lost badly. Later, the Cuman chief Khutan led his people into Hungary, seeking Bela's protection. Bela took them in, partly to boost his own cavalry, partly hoping the Cumans could help him stand against the Mongols. But to the Mongols, this meant Hungary was sheltering an enemy they were hunting. Of course, that's only one pretext. The deeper reason: the Hungarian plain sits inside the Carpathian Basin, ideal ground for steppe cavalry once they reached Central Europe. Let's turn back to the battle itself. Bela IV wasn't entirely unprepared, though. He called up nobles, bishops, and knights, trying to raise an army. But Hungary already had its own internal tensions. The king wanted to centralize power, and the nobles wouldn't cooperate. Meanwhile, the Cuman refugees clashed with the local population. Before the Mongols even reached the heartland, Hungary was already tearing itself apart. By the time the Mongols closed in, Europe had scraped together an army, still just a feudal force thrown together last minute. Before the battle, the Hungarian army made camp near the Sajo River. They circled wagons and tents into one huge laager, thinking it would keep Mongol cavalry out. It wasn't a foolish idea. Against a cavalry charge, a tight camp really can offer temporary protection. But the camp was packed, the lanes too narrow. Once pressure came from several sides, no one inside could move fast. To the Mongols, it wasn't a fortress. It was a self-made trap. At the start, the Mongols pressed the bridgehead first. If you were the Hungarian commander watching the Mongols pound the Sajo Bridge, you'd likely think, the decisive fight is right here. From the Hungarian view, hold the bridge, and Mongol cavalry can't cross the river in force. But that's exactly the conclusion Subutai wanted. On April 10th, the Mongols didn't wait for daylight. Batu held part of his force across the bridge, keeping up the frontal assault act, sending raiders to harass the bridgehead and keep Hungarian eyes glued to the bridge. Subutai hid the real killing blow in the dark. He sent troops to scout fords and had engineers build a pontoon bridge downstream. In short, while the Hungarians watched the bridge, the Mongols were already slipping in another way. The night before, the Hungarians had won something. They'd sortied out and driven back a small Mongol force. Easy to misread. Maybe the Mongols weren't so fearsome. The bridge held. Tonight, they could rest. Most of the army pulled back, leaving only a small guard on the bridge. For the Mongols, that lapse was exactly the window they wanted. At dawn on April 11th, the real assault began. Batu pressed hard at the bridge, catapults hurled stones and fire at the bridgehead, arrows pinned the defenders, and cavalry closed in wave after wave. Hungarian knights and infantry fought back from the bridge. Both sides bled badly there. This wasn't bloodless for the Mongols either. Batu's force took real pressure. But the goal wasn't to break the Hungarians outright, it was to pin them down, blind to what was coming from behind. Then came the most dangerous turn. Mongol light cavalry crossed at a ford to the north and slammed into the defenders' rear. Meanwhile, Subutai's main force crossed too, swinging behind the Hungarian camp. Only then did the Hungarians see it. They'd held a bridge, but lost control of the whole battlefield. Batu in front, Subutai at the rear. The bridge defenders broke, fled for camp, while Mongols pressed in from every side. Now the Hungarians' huge lager became a liability instead. Wagons, tents, supplies, horses, men, all jammed together. It sounded like protection. In real combat, no one could move. Heavy knights were built for the charge, but now boxed in, orders couldn't get through, ranks couldn't form, horses couldn't run. Mongol horse archers circled the camp, raining arrows from every angle, while catapults and fire weapons set the tents and supplies ablaze. The more chaos inside, the steadier the Mongols outside. To me, the scariest part of Mohi isn't that the Mongols were braver, it's that every step was calculated. Feigned retreat draws the Hungarians to the Sajo. The bridge feels like everything. A frontal push fixes your eyes. Then, the encirclement closes from behind. Every reasonable choice the Hungarians made became one more piece of the Mongol design. Next, the classic leave one side open. Mongol cavalry didn't seal the ring completely. They deliberately left a gap open on the west side, an apparent way out. What pulls people in despair? The path that looks like survival. Hungarian soldiers, knights, and camp followers all surged toward that gap, and whatever formation remained instantly fell apart. From formation to every man for himself, that's no longer an army. But that path was likely the death corridor the Mongols had prepared. Once outside, in open ground, heavy knights became a burden, and foot soldiers stood no chance against horses. Mongol riders flanked them, hunting with arrows, fall behind, turn to fight, or try to regroup, and you were cut down fast. Those left in camp were swallowed by fire, arrows, smoke, and panic. A once intact European royal army was shattered piece by piece. Through a misread bridge, a flanking move, chaos in camp, and slaughter on the run, Bela IV barely escaped. Hungary now lay wide open. The Mongol army swept into the Hungarian plain, burned Pest, and destroyed countless villages and towns. For Europeans then, this wasn't an ordinary defeat. It felt like the end of the world, early. They'd suddenly realized that everything they took pride in, knights, castles, noble blood, religious identity, couldn't stop this war machine rampaging in from the east. Back to our original question. They'd won, so why didn't they continue? West of Hungary lay Austria and Vienna. Further west, the German princes. To the south, they could have threatened the Adriatic and Italy. As many imagine it, Mongol cavalry could easily have ridden on toward Paris and Rome. But history took a turn. Around 1242, the Mongols pulled out of Hungary, back toward the Eastern European steppe. Europe never won that last battle. It just got a reprieve when the Mongols chose to stop. The classic explanation: Ögedei died. Ögedei was Genghis Khan's successor, the reigning Great Khan of the Mongol Empire. He died at the end of 1241, and Mongol nobles had to head east for the succession fight. This explanation holds up, because the Mongols weren't an ordinary army. They were an empire whose spoils were shared among the Genghisid princes. Batu commanded great strength on the Western Front, but ultimate power in the empire still answered to Karakorum, far to the east. The Khan's death turned the war into a reshuffling of imperial power, but I'm not satisfied calling it "the Khan died, so the Mongols went home." Batu never actually rushed back for the assembly, and he and Guyuk, his successor, didn't get along. Succession politics mattered, but it probably wasn't the only reason. A more reasonable read: Ogedei's death shifted the Mongol leadership's strategic priorities, and pushing deeper into Europe simply offered fewer political returns. For Batu, building his own power base in the West was likely more practical than risking unfamiliar Western Europe. Second, logistics and geography. Mongol cavalry needed its horses. Horses weren't just transportation, they were the army's fuel, its mobility, its lifeline. The Hungarian plain still suited cavalry, but further west came more rivers, forests, mountains, dense castles, and patchworks of farmland. Mongols could besiege cities fine. They'd taken plenty in Central Asia and China. But further west, they weren't facing one city. They faced a landscape chopped up into castles, parishes, valleys, and lordships. Breaking in was easy. Holding it wasn't. Finally, we can't ignore the environment. Recent climate research suggests that around 1242, the Hungarian region may have turned colder and wetter. What does wet, cold weather bring? Muddy roads, flooded rivers, shrinking grass, horses struggling to move. That's a headache for infantry-based powers. For an army as horse-dependent as the Mongols, it could hit combat power directly. More likely, the cold and wet simply raised the cost of fighting on. So, the Mongols' halt likely wasn't one cause, but several factors stacking together. The Khan's death reshaped imperial politics. Batu had his own western base to weigh. Hungary's and Western Europe's terrain eroded the cavalry edge, and castles threatened to turn quick conquest into long attrition. It wasn't that the Mongols suddenly couldn't fight. After victory, they recalculated. Was going further west worth it? Still, the Mongol withdrawal didn't mean Europe learned nothing. Hungary, especially, had been shaken awake. Bela later pushed for more stone castles, urging nobles to strengthen their defenses. That shift mattered. Decades later, when the Mongols invaded Hungary again, the picture looked nothing like 1241. More strongholds, a more spread-out defense network. It made a quick Mongol conquest far harder this time. In other words, this first invasion never conquered Europe, but it forced Europe to rethink defense, organization, and the speed of war. To the Mongols, leaving Europe wasn't failure. Batu went on to found the Golden Horde, holding sway over the Rus for generations. Moscow, Kiev, Vladimir. All these places were reshaped under the long shadow of Mongol rule and taxation. Mongol cavalry could sweep the plains, shatter kingdoms, leave all Europe praying in terror. But once war stopped being the cheap, familiar step game and turned into a long, riskier war of attrition, even the mighty Mongol Empire stopped. Medieval Europe survived a disaster it could barely escape, and after the fear passed, began rebuilding, reorganizing, learning, and waiting for its next age.